In the quiet embrace of the Ukrainian countryside, where the horizon stretches endlessly under vast skies, there once stood a village much like any other. Its name has been lost to time, but its rhythms, the turning of the seasons, the rustling of wheat, the murmur of daily life, were as familiar as the earth itself. This is the story of such a village in the year 1932, a year when the land was heavy with both harvest and silence. To understand this place, we must first step gently into its world. Picture, if you will, a cluster of whitewashed cottages with thatched roofs, their walls made of clay and straw, sturdy against the winters. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys, carrying the scent of burning birchwood. The village is surrounded by fields, endless golden fields of wheat and barley, rippling like water under the sun. Beyond them, patches of forest where oak and birch trees stand as silent witnesses. The people here lived by the land. Their lives were measured not by clocks, but by the sun's arc across the sky, by the growth of crops, by the births of calves and lambs. They woke with the dawn, their hands calloused from work, their clothing simple, homespun linen shirts, woolen vests, leather boots worn soft with use. The women wore long skirts and embroidered blouses, the patterns passed down through generations, each stitch a whisper of ancestry. In the early mornings, the village stirred slowly. A woman might step outside to draw water from the well, the bucket swaying on its rope. A man might check the edges of his scythe, running a thumb along the blade to test its sharpness. Children, still drowsy, would be roused to feed the chickens or gather kindling. There was no hurry, only the steady, familiar rhythm of tasks that had been done the same way for centuries. Breakfast was simple: dark rye bread, perhaps a slice of salo, cured pork fat, a bowl of porridge sweetened with honey or dried fruit. The bread was baked in communal ovens, the dough left to rise overnight. Each family had its own recipe, its own way of shaping the loaves. To break bread together was more than a meal. It was a promise of shared survival. This was a world of small things: a carefully mended shirt, a clay pot glazed with soot from the hearth, the way sunlight fell through a window in late afternoon. But in 1932, the world beyond the village was changing. The Soviet state had begun to collectivize the land, to gather the harvest into its hands. The villagers did not yet know how deep the silence would grow, how the ash would settle. But that is a story for another time. For now, let us rest here, in the quiet of the morning, in the warmth of the hearth, in the slow turning of the seasons. In the village, time moved with the seasons. Each month had its task, its own quiet demands. The earth was not just soil beneath their feet. It was a living thing, a partner in their survival. And so they listened to it, tended to it, with hands that knew the weight of seeds and the patience of growth. Spring arrived with the thawing of the frost. The men would harness the oxen to wooden plows, their blades biting into the dark, damp soil. The plows were simple things, carved from sturdy oak, reinforced with iron where needed. They left behind neat furrows, ready to cradle the seeds. Behind the plowmen came the women and children, scattering grain with wide, practiced arcs of their arms. Wheat, barley, rye, each handful was a hope for the months ahead. The fields were not the only places of labor. In the gardens beside each cottage, onions, garlic, and cabbages were planted in tight, orderly rows. Potatoes, those humble, dependable tubers, were tucked into mounds of earth. Herbs grew near the doorsteps, dill for pickling, chamomile for tea, poppies whose dried petals would later be stirred into kutia, a dish for remembrance. Summer was a time of long sunlit hours. The wheat grew tall, its stalks swaying in the breeze like a golden sea. The villagers moved through it, checking for blight, for pests, for the first signs of ripeness. Children were sent to scare away birds, waving sticks tied with strips of cloth. At midday, when the heat was heaviest, the workers might rest under the shade of an old pear tree, sharing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and spring onions, washed down with cool kvass made from fermented rye. Evenings were for mending and preparation. A man might carve a new handle for his scythe, the wood shavings curling at his feet. A woman would spin wool into yarn, the spindle whirling between her fingers as the firelight flickered. The tools they used were often made by hand, a sichka for cutting hay, a cherries for weaving baskets, a makoha for crushing poppy seeds. Each object bore the marks of its maker, the smoothness of years of use. And then the harvest, the most urgent time of all. The men moved in steady lines through the fields, their scythes flashing in the sun. The women followed, gathering the fallen stalks into sheaves, tying them with twisted straw. Even the smallest children helped, carrying water or chasing away mice. The work was hard, the days long, but there was a quiet satisfaction in it, too. The land had given its bounty, as it always had. But in 1932, the harvest was different. The quotas set by the state were higher than ever before. The wagons that carried the grain away did not return. The villagers watched and waited and wondered. Yet even then life continued. The bread was baked a little thinner, the porridge a little plainer. The earth was still there beneath them, steady as a heartbeat, and so they worked on. In the village, nothing was wasted. A fallen branch became a spoon, a scrap of wool became a sock, a lump of clay became a vessel to hold life's necessities. Every object told a story, not just of its making, but of the hands that shaped it, the needs it answered, the generations it served. On winter evenings, when the fields slept under snow, the men carved. A piece of maple or birch, carefully dried near the stove, would be whittled into a bowl, its curves smoothed by patient strokes. Spoons emerged from the wood, their handles sometimes decorated with simple geometric patterns, a row of triangles like fir trees, or interlocking circles like the links of a chain. These were not just tools, they were small acts of beauty in a practical world. The women spun, flax, wool, hemp. Each fiber had its own character. Flax was stubborn, needing to be soaked and beaten before it would yield its threads. Wool was softer, forgiving, dyed with onion skins or oak bark to bring color to the gray winters. The spinning wheel's steady hum was a sound as familiar as breathing, its rhythm unchanged for centuries. Then came the weaving. The loom stood in a corner of the house, its warp threads stretched taut. The patterns were memorized, not written down. Stripes for everyday cloth, intricate rushniki, embroidered towels for weddings and funerals, thick lizniki, blankets to keep out the cold. A skilled weaver could tell stories with her threads, encoding symbols of protection, fertility, or memory into the very fabric of daily life. Down by the riverbank, the potter worked. His wheel was a simple disc of wood, turned by hand or foot. The clay came from the earth nearby, dug in autumn when it was neither too wet nor too dry. Each pot was shaped for a purpose, a glechek for storing milk, a makitra for grinded poppy seeds, a kumanits for drinking water. Once fired in the kiln, they emerged reddish-brown and sturdy, ready to hold the village's food and drink for years to come. And always there was bacon. The clay oven, built into the wall of the house, was the heart of every home. Bread dough was left to rise under a linen cloth, then slid into the oven on a long wooden paddle. The heat was judged by experience. Too hot, and the crust would blacken. Too cool, and the loaf would be dense. But when it was just right, the bread emerged golden, its scent filling the house like a promise. These were the rhythms of making, not hurried, not wasteful, but slow and sure. Even as the world outside grew uncertain, these tasks remained. The turning of the wheel, the weaving of the cloth, the kneading of the dough, they were acts of faith in a way, a belief that tomorrow would come and that hands would still be there to shape it. In the village, food was more than sustenance. It was memory, ritual, the quiet alchemy of turning raw ingredients into something that could last through the lean months. Every step, from field to table, was measured, deliberate, a collaboration with the seasons. Mornings began with kasha, buckwheat or barley porridge, cooked slowly in a clay pot until the grain swelled into creamy softness. A dollop of fresh butter or a drizzle of honey might grace the top if the larder allowed. In summer, wild berries, bilberries, raspberries, the tart juravlina, cranberry, were stirred in for sweetness. In winter, dried apples or pears lent their muted perfume. The midday meal was often borscht, though not always the rich beet-laden version known today. In spring, it might be green borscht made with sorrel and young nettles, sharp and bright. In autumn, mushrooms foraged from the forest deepened the broth. A bone or scrap of meat was a rarity, saved for feast days, but a single smoked rib could flavor an entire pot for days. Preservation was an art. Cabbage was packed into barrels with carrots and dill, left to ferment into kvashena kapusta, its tang a welcome counterpoint to winter's monotony. Cucumbers sat in brine under a weighted stone. Berries were spread on linen in the sun to dry, their sugars concentrating into chewy morsels that would reappear in uzvar, a compote of dried fruit simmered with honey. The cellar was a treasure trove. Shelves held crocks of pickles, jars of lard sealed under wax, sacks of grain safe from mice. Potatoes rested in darkness, their skins thick and earthy. Above, strings of dried mushrooms dangled like strange ornaments, their umami richness waiting to revive a pot of soup. Evening meals were simple. Dark rye bread with salo, cured pork fat, perhaps a bowl of kapustniak, cabbage soup thickened with a handful of millet. Leftover borscht might be reheated, its flavors melding further overnight. To drink, there was kvass, barely alcoholic, faintly sour, or herbal teas of mint, linden, or chamomile, gathered from the meadow's edge. In 1932, these rhythms began to falter. The state's demands left pantries emptier, meals thinner. Yet still, the knowledge persisted. How to stretch a handful of grain with bran. How to bake clay-hard lipa bread that could be softened with broth when teeth grew too weak for crusts. The hearth's wisdom was older than hunger, and it endured. The village measured time not in months, but in rituals, small ceremonies that tied them to the land, to the dead, to each other. These were not grand affairs, but quiet acts of remembrance, as natural as checking the sky for rain. Winter began with diduk, the grandfather's spirit. On Christmas Eve, the eldest son would drag a sheaf of wheat into the house, its stalks whispering against the floorboards. It was placed in the corner where icons hung, a promise that next year's harvest would return. The family ate 12 meatless dishes that night: poppy seed kutia, honeyed porridge, boiled peas. An extra plate was set for ancestors, whose breath might frost the window pane. Spring's arrival was marked by Vesnyanki, songs sung by girls at dawn, their voices floating over thorn fields. They carried wooden whistles shaped like birds, piping melodies to wake the earth. Every household painted eggs before Easter, using onion skins for russet red, birch leaves for pale green. The patterns, endless lines for eternity, stars for guidance, were traced in beeswax before dyeing, a secret language in pigment and wax. On cupola night, when summer hung heavy with the scent of linden blossoms, youths leaped over fires for luck. Girls floated wreaths of flowers and candles down the river. If one stayed alight till the bend, it meant marriage within the year. The bravest ventured into the forest at midnight, searching for the mythical fern flower that bloomed only this one night, its glow revealing hidden truths. Harvest's end brought Obzinki, the closing of the fields. The last sheaf was woven into a wreath and carried home with singing, then hung from the rafters until spring planting. A handful of grain was always left unharvested for the Polovik, the field spirit who slept beneath the soil. To take everything was to invite his wrath. Even in 1932, as the state forbade such superstitions, the rituals persisted in whispers. A cross, drawn in the dirt before sowing, a crust of bread tucked into the pocket of a traveler. The village knew some silences were louder than laws. A village house was more than walls and a roof. It was a living body. The floor was its feet, worn smooth by generations. The hearth was its heart, never allowed to grow cold. The attic, where herbs dried in shadowy bundles, was its memory. Most homes were kata, single-room dwellings built of logs or wattle and daub, their walls packed with a mix of clay, straw, and sometimes horsehair for strength. The thatch roof, thick as a man's arm, was woven from reeds or rye straw in overlapping layers, each one shedding rain like a duck's feathers. In heavy snows, the weight would make the roof side downward, but it never broke, only bent, resilient as the people beneath it. Every corner had its purpose. The red corner near the east wall held the family icons, draped with rushnike embroidered with tree of life motifs. Opposite it stood the stove, massive, whitewashed, its belly large enough to sleep atop during bitter nights. Between them, the table, never placed diagonally, for that was how corpses were laid out before burial. Space held rules as unspoken as grammar. Windows were small, their panes made of blown glass if the family was wealthy, or scraped animal bladder if they were not. In winter, they'd be sealed with clay or rags to keep out the vuk, the malicious draught believed to carry illness. But in summer, they stood open, letting in the scent of lilacs and the sound of bees in the hollyhocks planted by the doorstep. Outbuildings clustered around the house like chicks around a hen. A klunya for tools, its roof piled high with sunflower stalks for winter fodder. A komora for grain, its floor raised on mushroom-shaped stones to deter mice. A koliba for summer cooking, where women boiled jam from plums to avoid overheating the main house. Even the well had its own little roof, as if the water too needed shelter from the world. By 1932, some houses stood empty, their doors gaping, yet those still occupied kept their rhythms. A woman might still sweep the packed earth floor with a broom of birch twigs, the motion sending up little puffs of dust like sighs. The stove might still be banked with embers at night, its warmth a fragile defiance against the growing cold outside. Beyond the fields where the wheat gave way to wild grasses, the forest waited, not as a stranger, but as a neighbor, one who offered mushrooms like gifts, herbs like advice, and warnings in the creak of its branches. Children learned the forest's alphabet early. Birch bark, peeled carefully in vertical strips, could be folded into containers for berries or kindling. Oak galls, hard as marbles, were ground into ink. Willow switches, soaked in stream water, became pliant enough to weave into fish traps. Every tree had its use, its story. Mushroom gathering was women's work, done in the hush of dawn when dew still silvered the caps. They knew the pidpanky, bullets, by their stout, nutty flesh, the riziki, saffron milk caps, by the orange milk that wept from their gills. Deadly pale toadstools were left untouched, though some whispered they could be boiled 9 times to make medicine, if one knew the right prayers to say over the pot. Herbs were harvested with rituals. Zilia, St. John's wort, was cut at midsummer, its yellow flowers packed in oil to make a balm for wounds. Miata, mint, was gathered before flowering, tied in bunches to dry under the eaves. Pollen, wormwood, was never brought indoors. It belonged to the spirits, a thing of borders and thresholds. The forest had its own time. A fallen log might host generations of beetles before crumbling into soil. A fox's den, hidden among roots, might be used for decades. Even the shadows moved differently here, pooling under ferns like dark water. Villagers came to gather, not to conquer. They took only what they needed, leaving offerings, a crust of bread, a strand of hair, to show gratitude. In 1932, the forest grew busier. Those who ventured deeper than usual returned with pockets full of sorrel or cattail roots, their faces carefully blank. The old rules still held: never whistle after dark, never answer a voice that calls your name from the thickets. But hunger made some bold. They remembered the stories of Lisavik, who led the greedy astray, of Mavka, who lured the lonely into bogs. Yet still they went, because the fields had gone quiet. When dusk settled over the village, it did not come all at once, but in stages, like a blanket being unfolded, corner by corner. The light did not vanish so much as it retreated, pooling in the hollows of the room before slipping away entirely. And with it came the rituals of rest, small ceremonies to prepare both body and home for the night. Evening began with washing. A basin of water, warmed by the last embers of the stove, would be placed near the door. Hands, still smelling of soil or flour, were rinsed clean. Faces were wiped with a damp cloth, children first, then the adults. The water, now gray with the day's labor, was never thrown out immediately. To spill it after dark was to risk inviting restless spirits inside. Beds were simple things, a wooden frame strung with rope or leather strips, topped with a mattress stuffed with straw or dried corn husks. In winter, feather beds were pulled from heavy chests, down collected over years from geese plucked in autumn. Pillows were often filled with buckwheat hulls, their faint, nutty scent lingering in the linen. There was an art to arranging them, to tucking the edges just so beneath the sleeping body as if to cocoon the sleeper from the night's uncertainties. Light was precious. A candle might be lit just long enough to find one's way to bed, then extinguished, its wax saved, its wick trimmed for tomorrow. Some homes kept a lucina, a splinter of resinous pine stuck into a crack in the wall. When lit, it gave off a smoky, resinous light, just enough to see by if a child cried out in the dark. Sleep did not come all at once, but in layers. First, the murmurs of the day's last conversations, a whispered prayer, a reminder to latch the door. Then the settling of the house itself, the faint pop of cooling timber, the scuttle of a mouse in the thatch. Finally, dreams. Not the grand visions of prophets, but small, ordinary things. The smell of fresh bread, the sound of rain on the roof, the warmth of a hand that had long since turned to earth. In 1932, the nights grew longer. Hunger gnawed at the edges of sleep, turning rest into something fragile, yet still the rituals held. The bed was made, the candle was lit, then put out. The prayers were murmured into the dark, because even then, even as the world outside grew colder, there was a kind of defiance in the act of lying down, closing one's eyes, and trusting that morning would come. Animals were never just property in the village. They were witnesses to human life, companions in labor, silent keepers of routines. A cow knew when to nudge the gate at milking time. A rooster marked the hours more faithfully than any clock. And in return, the villagers spoke to them not as masters, but as partners in the fragile balance of survival. Before dawn, women would crouch beside their cows, foreheads pressed against warm flanks as they milked. Each cow had a name: Zorka for the one with stars on her brow, Morena for the red-coated matriarch who ruled the herd. The milk, still steaming, was poured through a sieve of woven horsehair to catch stray straw or dirt. What couldn't be drunk fresh was left in shallow clay pots to clabber into riazhanka, its tartness cut with a drizzle of honey. Chickens were the alchemists of the farmyard, turning kitchen scraps and beetles into eggs with shells like polished limestone. Children were tasked with collecting them, hands cupped around still warm treasures. A good laying hen might be spared the pot for years, her feathers plucked only when she molted, to stuff pillows or fletch arrows. Bees were the keepers of secrets. Their hives, hollowed logs or woven sapés, were tended with murmured words, never shouts. To steal honey without offering smoke first was to invite stings. To spill it carelessly was to waste gold. In autumn, families would cut just enough comb to sustain them through winter, leaving the rest for the colony's survival. The bees, it was said, remembered kindness. Horses held a sacred place. They pulled plows, carried brides to weddings, and in the end drew the carts that took the dead to churchyards. Their manes were braided with ribbons on feast days, their hooves smudged with garlic paste to ward off illness. A man might go hungry himself, rather than let his horse's ribs show through its coat. By 1932, the barns grew quieter. A cow sold here, a hive abandoned there, yet those animals that remained were tended with desperate care. Their warmth, their milk, their eggs now lifelines. People whispered to them more than ever, as if their simple presence could stave off the silence creeping in from the fields. When the hunger was over, though hunger is never truly over, only paused, the village remained. Not as it had been, but changed, like a field after fire. The soil remembers, The trees remember, and the objects left behind, worn smooth by hands that would never touch them again, became quiet witnesses. Consider the spoon, carved from maple, its bowl darkened by years of borscht and porridge, left behind because no one would take what couldn't feed 'em. Now it rests on a sill, where the sun warms it each morning, as if waiting for fingers to lift it again. There is a stubbornness in this, the way ordinary things outlast their use, the way they refuse to vanish. Or the embroidery? A girl began this before the snows came, pricking her finger more than once as she worked the red and black threads. She left it when she went to the city, or the next world, no one recalls which, but the vine she stitched still grows across the fabric, forever unfinished, forever alive in its way. The land, too, persisted. The wheat returned, though no one had saved seed. Some stalks always escaped the scythe. Wild plums bloomed where orchards had been cut for firewood. Foxes denned in abandoned root cellars, their pups tumbling over rusted scythe blades. Life moved around the absence, as water flows around a stone. And the rituals? They slipped into whispers, but did not die. A woman might still toss a handful of salt over her shoulder when cooking, though no one spoke of domovic spirits anymore. A man might still tap his boot against the threshold before entering, though he'd forgotten why. These were the roots left in the earth, waiting. The village's story did not end. It became the creak of a gate no one oiled, the smell of rye from a field no one remembered planting. It became the way an old man's hands still shaped loaves from air when he dreamed. This is how the quiet survives, not in monuments, but in the bend of a stalk of wheat, in the weight of a spoon left behind, in the patience of the land,